1971. The air inside KGB headquarters was electric with tension. A courier, dressed in civilian gray, delivered a sealed folder to the sixth-floor destination. General Nikolai Zakharov, head of Directorate O Soviet Counterintelligence. The title on the front, Breach. Radio Command Incident, Baltic Region. Inside were transcripts. Not Soviet transcripts, but American ones. Dozens of pages, typed in English, clean and precise. They outlined verbatim Soviet military communications, regiment-level orders, radio call signs, encrypted frequency shifts, entire command packets, recorded and translated, and the timestamps were damning. These weren't old logs, decoded months later. They were same-day intercepts. Some arrived before the orders had even been relayed down Soviet chains of command. Zakharov stared at the final page. It bore a chilling line, scribbled in a U.S. analyst's handwriting. Signal source located via cross-pattern triangulation. Presumed origin within Kaliningrad. Command net. The Soviets had always assumed their military radio nets were secure, heavily encrypted, frequency hopping, and limited in range. They were wrong. Somewhere, somehow, the Americans had slipped inside, not from the air, not through orbit, but from the inside. For over a decade, the Soviets had monitored NATO broadcasts, run endless counterintelligence sweeps, and constructed a maze of encryption protocols for command-level communications. They had arrested hundreds suspected of treason, rotated call signs, and deployed newer radio gear with narrower frequency ranges. Yet still the breach had occurred. At first, the KGB suspected a mole, but within hours, they realized no human leak could account for the breadth and precision of what the Americans knew. They weren't just hearing Soviet voices. They were recording entire command architectures, including fallback protocols, redundant signals, and authentication methods. In the Baltics, a Soviet mechanized infantry division had maneuvered 3 days earlier. It should have been invisible radio, silent, protected under layers of signal masking and tight-loop encryption. Yet somehow, its movement paths, call-outs, and command log entries appeared in a U.S. briefing 3 days before the operation began. How? The answer, the KGB would soon discover, was as devastating as it was simple. The Americans hadn't broken the code. They'd embedded themselves within the net, listening not from afar but from within Warsaw Pact territory itself. Zakharov set down the folder and picked up the red hotline to the Defense Ministry. There would be no sleep tonight, because the Cold War had just shifted from silence and suspicion to sound and exposure. In the quiet sanctums of Soviet intelligence inside Lubyanka's war rooms and GRU's secure basements, one belief had gone unchallenged for over a decade: that Soviet military radio nets were functionally unbreakable, encrypted, frequency-agile, and buried beneath layers of analog redundancy. The system had been engineered to withstand everything from nuclear interference to enemy eavesdropping. From the Red Army's perspective, their radio doctrine didn't need improvement. It was a closed loop secure by design, guarded by protocol, and enforced with brutal counterintelligence. Every Soviet field commander was drilled in radio discipline. Short transmissions, encrypted code words, signal masks, and above all, never repeat. Every battalion, regiment, and theater command relied on a rigid communications pyramid designed to obscure structure and origin. In theory, if the Americans ever intercepted something, it would sound like random, static, meaningless noise without context. But the theory had a flaw. It was written by men who believed only in technical superiority, not in operational infiltration. From 1965 to 1975, the KGB believed their biggest vulnerability came from space. American reconnaissance satellites, with high-powered antennas and orbital paths over Warsaw Pact territories, were feared as the primary threat to secure communications. To counter this, the USSR invested in directional antennas, signal dispersion masking, and shielded bunkers. Then came the assumption that U.S. submarines and aircraft might be hovering at the periphery, grabbing fragments of long-range broadcasts. So the Soviets adjusted their transmission power, restricted propagation zones, and constantly updated radio frequencies. What they never considered, never truly feared, was that the Americans would plant listening posts directly inside Soviet-controlled soil. Not spy rings, not defectors, not bugs inside buildings, but passive signal traps embedded near military installations, camouflaged as electrical gear, or hidden inside diplomatic buildings during maintenance upgrades. Small, unmanned, and impossible to detect without knowing where to look. Even more dangerously, the Soviets assumed that if the Americans were listening, they couldn't keep up. Soviet communication protocols were built on layered ciphers, rotating keys, and codebooks that changed every 30 days. But the Americans didn't need to break the code immediately. They just needed the data. And they were getting all of it, every packet, every wave, every misplaced call sign. By the time a Soviet tank regiment rolled, the U.S. already knew its fuel stops, command relay structure, and fallback positions. Because the flaw wasn't in the encryption, it was in the assumption that no one was listening from inside. The KGB believed in a fortress of sound, but the Americans had walked through the side door, and no one had heard them coming. The Soviet Union's radio doctrine was not designed for subtlety. It was designed for mass. Dozens of overlapping signals, high-powered bursts, and command messages repeated across multiple frequencies to ensure reception in all weather, terrain, and combat conditions. In Soviet thinking, redundancy was resilience. What they didn't realize was that redundancy also created patterns. And in those patterns, America found the weak points. The Soviet system emphasized centralized control. Orders flowed top-down from theater command to regiments, relayed by intermediate headquarters, over preset frequencies. Each tier repeated core instructions, often with slight delays, creating a cascade of confirmatory chatter. For a disciplined force, it was efficient. For an outside observer, it was a treasure map. What cracked the doctrine wasn't brute force decryption. It was real-time signal mapping. By the late 1960 seconds, the United States had shifted its signals, intelligence, strategy. It was no longer just about intercepting enemy radio. It was about trapping it. NSA engineers, in coordination with CIA field teams and select military detachments, had begun deploying miniature, passive listening posts, devices no bigger than a suitcase, powered by solar panels or hidden battery cells. These were not located at borders or high vantage points. They were buried inside the Warsaw Pact's own infrastructure, next to relay stations, inside neutral embassies, beneath utility buildings. One such device, codenamed Midas 7, was smuggled into Hungary inside a diplomatic generator box and planted near a military radio tower. For 9 months, it collected every outbound and inbound signal, time-stamped and cataloged by frequency, intensity, and burst pattern. More importantly, it was linked to a relay drone that flew a predictable, low-orbit path near the Austrian border. Every few days, Midas would dump its encrypted cache during a narrow 6-second window. The Americans never needed to hack live signals. They simply vacuumed everything. Knowing time and pattern would do the rest. On the analytical side, software like Harvest and Argus early NSA data sorters cross-referenced signal patterns with known command structures. If a unit in East Germany went quiet and another lit up 50 kilometers away on a matching frequency, the system flagged it as a probable move. The result? An evolving map of Soviet deployments, not built from photos or spies, but from radio footprints. Soviet doctrine hadn't accounted for this kind of surveillance. It had assumed radio space was ephemeral, invisible, uncatchable. But to the Americans, it was a battlefield, all its own. And the Soviet military was broadcasting its plans across it every single day. The doctrine was about to break, not because of betrayal, but because it never imagined an enemy that could listen faster than they could speak. In early March 1976, Soviet forces in East Germany prepared for a classified military maneuver, codename Zarnitsa, involving the 10th Guards Tank Division. The operation was designed to simulate a rapid redeployment under NATO attack, with a full armored brigade mobilizing across key river crossings under the cover of darkness. Everything had been rehearsed. Radio frequencies had been rotated, transmission codes updated. Orders were issued over hardened lines and confirmed by encrypted shortwave packets. The movement schedule was known only to division staff, and even then, split between segments. To Soviet command, this was airtight. To American analysts, it was already an open book. 2 days before Zarnitsa began, inside a nondescript trailer in West Germany, U.S. Army SIGINT officers reviewed a compiled intercept log. The data drawn from 2 ground posts and a 3rd passive relay node codenamed OWL-12 outlined every call sign, route designation, and unit formation tied to the upcoming exercise. A separate brief, distributed to senior NATO command, included predicted river crossing times accurate to within 15 minutes. None of this was based on overhead imagery. It all came from captured radio. Even more stunning, several Soviet message fragments were decrypted using pattern recognition software that hadn't even existed 6 months earlier. Known as Treeline, the system didn't crack the encryption. It predicted message types based on syntax length, known procedural formats, and audio waveform variants. A burst with 4 short pings, followed by 1 long, repeated across 2 frequencies, was likely a regimental movement confirmation. By the time the 10th Guards Tank Division reached the Elbe River, American analysts had already logged their crossings. Even more embarrassingly, simulated U.S. counterplans were drawn up and executed in war games before the Soviet exercise even finished. These drills, held at Grafenwehr, reflected the exact positions of Soviet armor information obtained not through espionage, but from the airwaves. Back in Moscow, KGB officials were dumbfounded. No spies had been caught. No leaks traced. Every signal had followed approved encryption and frequency protocols, and yet the Americans knew everything. A Soviet colonel, questioned days later about unusual radio chatter during the exercise, insisted all codes had been triple verified. The KGB didn't believe him, but the truth was far worse. There had been no traitor. The Americans had simply heard too much, too well, too soon, and no one in the Soviet system could explain how, because to them, what had happened was impossible. And yet, it had just become reality. The report that landed on the desk of KGB, Chairman Yuri Andropov, was brief, brutal, and unbelievable. NATO forces had reacted to a Soviet division's movements before the exercise began. Specifics matched internal orders, frequencies, unit call signs, even anticipated fallback positions. The only logical explanation? A traitor. But there was no traitor. In Moscow, panic doesn't look like shouting. It looks like silence. Andropov called for an immediate internal counterintelligence operation, Operation Chiska. Every officer involved in Zarnitsa was interrogated. Field radios were seized. Encoding gear dismantled and flown back to Moscow for inspection. Soviet SIGINT engineers combed through thousands of logs. If the Americans were listening, how? The first theory was traditional espionage. Someone on the inside had relayed the plans, but polygraphs showed nothing. Financial audits were clean. No suspicious travel or unexplained wealth. Dozens of officers, some highly decorated, were placed on non-active status while the search expanded. The second theory focused on external interception. High-altitude aircraft like the RC-135 were known to patrol European airspace. Could one have captured the transmissions? It seemed plausible until analysts pointed out the intercepts included pre-transmission planning data, such as shift schedules and signal preambles, not just live orders. That meant someone or something was recording pre-broadcast material, possibly from inside Warsaw Pact territory. The implications were unthinkable. It would mean that the Americans had managed to place listening devices autonomous, undetectable, and reliable within the Soviet radio infrastructure itself. And that shattered every assumption about communications security the USSR had clung to for 2 decades. Still, disbelief held firm. General Semyon Tesvigun, deputy chairman of the KGB, dismissed the idea of internal placement. "This is a Western bluff," he told his aides. "A psychological operation to induce paranoia." But over the following months, more incidents surfaced. Another exercise in Czechoslovakia, a naval maneuver in the Baltic, a rocket deployment drill in Ukraine. Each time, NATO responses appeared too calibrated, too informed, and each time the same report came back. No spies, no leaks, no communications, anomaly, detected. In desperation, the KGB launched a quiet audit of every Warsaw Pact embassy's repair and maintenance logs. They found American contractors had serviced several neutral embassy buildings within the last 5 years. One signal relay located beneath a Yugoslav embassy kitchen had a replacement generator fitted by a firm later linked to U.S. intelligence. It was the first crack in the story, a faint trail. But for Moscow, still locked in disbelief, it wasn't enough. The party line remained unchanged. The West was bluffing. But beneath the surface, the silence of certainty had been broken, and Soviet confidence in their untouchable radio fortress had started to unravel bit by bit, wave by wave. By late 1976, the Kremlin's silence had transformed into suspicion, but it moved in the wrong direction. If the Americans weren't using spies, and no tampering had been confirmed inside Warsaw Pact infrastructure, there was only one explanation left that senior Soviet officials were willing to accept: satellite interception. From their war rooms and intelligence vaults, Soviet generals spun up a comforting narrative. The Americans must be using high-altitude surveillance platforms, either spy satellites in low Earth orbit or the RC-135 Rivet joint aircraft, to suck up wide-spectrum radio bursts. Across the Eastern Bloc, the signals weren't compromised from within. They were being harvested from space. The theory fit Soviet biases. They already feared U.S. advancements in aerospace intelligence. Programs like Corona, Gambit, and Hexagon had shown that the U.S. could photograph missile silos from orbit. Perhaps those same orbital birds had sprouted antennae. New protocols were introduced almost overnight. Field commands were ordered to decrease transmission power to minimize atmospheric bounce. Directional antennas became mandatory for all regimental nodes. In sensitive units, orders shifted from voice to burst transmission short, pre-encoded data packets lasting under 1.5 seconds. Commanders were told to increase the use of landline communication, even during mobile deployments. The KGB issued technical memos warning of ionospheric signal slippage, theorizing that certain wavelengths could reflect off the upper atmosphere and be intercepted by American orbital collectors, an idea mostly grounded in guesswork and paranoia. They even pulled in engineers from the Soviet space program, asking for emergency upgrades to signal shielding. New ground station layouts were drawn up. Frequency hopping algorithms were adjusted. Transmission schedules staggered to create randomization. But none of it worked. Because the real threat wasn't coming from orbit. It was already on the ground. While Soviet engineers adjusted dish angles and swapped cables, passive American listening posts planted near transmission nodes or inside diplomatic buildings continued to hoover up every signal. These devices didn't care about directional beams or burst lengths. They were sitting within the effective range inside the wire. To the NSA, the Soviet changes were barely a speed bump. Signal analysts simply recalibrated filters and updated pattern recognition algorithms. In some cases, the new Soviet protocols actually made it easier to identify sensitive messages, since high-security traffic followed stricter formats and timing patterns. But in Moscow, the belief in satellite interception remained gospel. It was convenient. It was distant. It didn't require confronting the terrifying truth that American devices were buried in Soviet soil, listening silently. They thought they had identified the breach, but they were just staring at the stars, while the Americans sat in their shadow. When the satellite interception theory began to collapse under its own contradictions, Soviet leadership turned sharply inward, and violently so. The new explanation was even more dangerous. NATO had bribed Warsaw Pact radio officers. It was classic Cold War logic. If external systems weren't to blame, then betrayal had to be the answer. A human one. Orders rippled out from KGB headquarters. Launch an internal purge. Sweep the ranks for traitors. Within weeks, a quiet wave of arrests hit the Soviet-aligned militaries across Eastern Europe. In Poland, 6 radio operators were detained without charges. In East Germany, 2 Signal Corps officers vanished from their posts during routine maintenance operations and were later reported relocated by the Stasi. In Hungary, a technical unit commander was interrogated for 6 days straight over minor discrepancies in signal logs. His career ended, though no charges were filed. The logic was brutal but clear. The Americans knew too much. Someone had to be feeding them. A dozen signal intelligence drills were shut down. All Warsaw Pact radio teams were ordered to undergo immediate retraining in counterintelligence procedures. Trust no one became the unofficial motto of every signal regiment from Vilnius to Varna. Even more radical, the Soviet Second Chief Directorate, charged with internal counter-espionage, began a secret surveillance campaign targeting their own SIGINT officers. Some were followed. Others had their homes bugged. Still more had their families' finances combed for signs of Western contact. But for all the fury, there was one problem. No one confessed. Not under pressure. Not under surveillance. Not even under threats to their families. The signal officers, those supposedly leaking secrets to NATO, had no secrets to give because they weren't the source. The listening posts that fed the NSA were unmanned, automated, and undetectable without advanced sweeps or detailed construction records. They were neither moles nor machines that broadcast back. They waited, quietly, logging thousands of encrypted packets and passing them to American handlers via burst transmission or on-the-ground collection. The Soviets kept arresting humans while machines did the listening. By the end of 1977, morale within Soviet signal units was eroding. Officers were terrified of being accused, stripped of rank, or quietly reassigned to punishment battalions. Re-enlistment rates in certain regiments dropped sharply. Commanders grew paranoid, not of NATO, but of their own command. And still, the intercepts continued. American analysts back at Fort Meade and Ramstein Air Base noticed no disruption. Signals came in like clockwork. Patterns held. Frequency shifts were noted and adjusted for. The web held strong. In the silence of their bunkers, Soviet generals had imagined treason. But the real betrayal had come from within their own confidence in a system built on the belief that only men could spy. They had no idea that machines were already inside the wire. It would take years for the Soviet Union to grasp the full scale of what had happened. And by the time it did, the damage was irreparable. The breach wasn't tactical. It was architectural. The entire Soviet approach to signal security, rooted in centralized planning, analog encryption, and rigid protocol, had been designed for a different kind of war. A war of loud transmissions, predictable enemies, and clear borders. But the Americans weren't playing by those rules. The intelligence failure wasn't just in underestimating American capabilities. It was in misunderstanding American intent. While the Soviets obsessed over grand strategy, division-level deployments, theater-scale command structures, and missile readiness, the Americans had gone microscopic. They didn't need to hear everything. They just needed the right fragments, recorded over time, mapped against known behavior, and analyzed by software that learned from every intercept. The NSA had quietly built the world's most advanced pattern recognition system. It didn't rely on real-time translation. It didn't care about broken encryption. It tracked signal shapes, durations, transmission rhythms, and unit calling behaviors. The goal wasn't to read Soviet mail, it was to map the way they sent it. For years, That's exactly what U.S. listening posts, buried, passive, and nearly invisible, had done. In some cases, devices were hidden inside compromised Warsaw Pact facilities. In others, they were embedded within embassy renovations, disguised as electrical components, or planted by elite CIA black teams operating under false diplomatic cover. Once in place, they required no maintenance. They simply recorded at Fort Meade. NSA linguists and signal technicians had compiled entire digital shadows of Soviet units. How long a regiment took to respond to new orders, which call signs belonged to which commanders, what encryption cycles matched which signal bands. Even more damning, NSA analysts could predict when Soviet units were preparing for exercises or redeployments based on background chatter known as preparatory haze, a spike in non-combat radio traffic that always preceded movement. All of this meant that, while the Soviets believed their secrets were locked behind a wall of ciphers and steel, the Americans had quietly constructed a window, and the view was perfect. But what made the intelligence failure catastrophic was the Soviet response. Instead of innovating, they repressed. Instead of adapting, they arrested. Instead of restructuring their radio doctrine, they doubled down on it, building ever more complex systems on a foundation already compromised. The Americans didn't have to escalate. They didn't even have to act. They simply watched. And in doing so, they acquired a view of Soviet military behavior that no spy ring, no satellite, and no defector could ever provide. It wasn't just a listening operation. It was a doctrine-crushing machine operating in silence, beneath Moscow's nose, while the Red Army marched confidently into the unknown. By the late 1970s, the true American system wasn't just a network of radios, analysts, or satellites. It was a fusion, a living ecosystem of signals, dominance, driven by speed, silence, and software. It began with SIGINT layering. Rather than rely on a single source, the U.S. stacked passive listening nodes, long-range aircraft, underwater taps, and even space-based platforms into a coordinated web. Each node didn't just listen, it correlated. A signal picked up in Berlin could be triangulated with a packet heard in Turkey and confirmed by a data point relayed from the North Sea. Then came automation. At the heart of Fort Meade, the NSA ran a battery of IBM 360 mainframes dedicated not to decryption but to pattern recognition. The system, codenamed Pinecone, wasn't looking for full sentences. It scanned waveform signatures, pulse gaps, and unit-specific formatting. Once a Soviet transmission was captured, regardless of encryption, it could be tagged, indexed, and tracked. Not for hours, for years. More impressive still was the learning loop. Each intercept fed into predictive models. Which unit used which encoding schemes? What times of day command changes occurred? How long signals lasted before command confirmations were issued? Every repetition created fingerprints, digital trails, of an army that believed it was invisible. But the true weapon wasn't hardware. It was the pivot to preemption. In 1974, the U.S. Navy quietly upgraded its airborne SIGINT platforms like the EP-3 Ares, with real-time linkbacks to processing centers. This meant captured transmissions could be analyzed within minutes. The next logical step: predictive deployment. If SIGINT indicated an armored brigade was preparing for movement, U.S. planners didn't wait. They moved first with satellites, recon flights, even psychological operations. Soviet commanders couldn't understand how NATO seemed to always be in the right place at the right time. They never suspected that their own radios, signals sent in confidence, were giving away the future. One stunning case came in 1978, during a Warsaw Pact chemical weapons drill. Intercepts of low-level encrypted signals showed repeated test call signs and unusual nighttime activity. Within 48 hours, U.S. Analysts had mapped the likely location and notified allies. British special operations teams set up a counter-observation zone before the exercise even began. Soviet officers never knew they'd been tracked in real time until photos surfaced years later. The Soviets believed electronic warfare was a tactical weapon. America made it strategic. Beyond intercepts, they wove this insight into weapons development. New U.S. cruise missiles, air defense systems, and stealth tactics were all informed by knowledge of Soviet radio doctrine, not theory patterns. How and when the Soviets deployed radars, what frequencies they favored, how often they changed keys. It even shaped foreign policy. During arms negotiations, U.S. diplomats sometimes knew more about Soviet military postures than the generals across the table. Confidence flowed from data. And because the system was decentralized, spanning aircraft, ground posts, embassies, and even merchant vessels, the Soviets could never shut it down. There was no single source, only a symphony of silence. This was the American system, a global, invisible lattice of ears, logic, and anticipation. And it never fired a shot, because it never had to. In April 1979, a Soviet motorized rifle division stationed near the Polish border prepared for a massive readiness inspection. It was a show of strength, timed to coincide with NATO's annual Reforger exercise. Everything about it was symbolic. Tanks on the move, air defense radars humming, encrypted orders bouncing between regimental HQs. It was a performance for both internal reassurance and external intimidation. But within 72 hours, it became a textbook case of humiliation by silence. American forces didn't react with bluster. They reacted with precision. Before the first BMPs rolled out, SIGINT teams at Bad Aibling Station in West Germany had already flagged the uptick in encrypted activity. A spike in pre-format radio packets matched deployment patterns from 3 prior exercises. Within hours, U.S. analysts reconstructed the maneuver's likely scope unit movements, duration, and even command handoff schedules. And then something extraordinary happened. An RC 135 volts rivet joint aircraft flew a deliberate track parallel to the Soviet formation outside Warsaw Pact airspace, but clearly mirroring their movements. It transmitted nothing. It simply loitered. Then came the EC 121 seconds, circling further back, passively collecting emissions. In response, the Soviets tried frequency hopping, switched ciphers, even briefly activated jamming. Nothing worked. Because by then, the Americans weren't listening to content. They were watching behavior. On day 2 of the exercise, NATO launched its own parallel maneuver in West Germany. Armor units were positioned in reaction zones that perfectly countered Soviet flanking drills. Helicopter deployments increased. Electronic warfare units were suddenly repositioned to interfere, not randomly, but at exact intervals where Soviet backup relays would switch frequencies. Soviet commanders were stunned. It was as if NATO had read their playbook. They hadn't. They'd heard it weeks earlier, months earlier. Across thousands of signals the Soviets had assumed were lost in the ether. As a final blow, a small U.S. recon satellite, KH-11 Crystal, passed overhead at the precise moment the Soviets launched their final push of the exercise. Within 24 hours, grainy photos of disorganized staging zones were passed to NATO commanders with exact timestamps matching intercepted Soviet orders. Soviet analysts couldn't believe it. Every move tracked, every signal captured, every shadow followed. Back in Moscow, furious meetings consumed the upper ranks of the GRU and KGB. Some argued the Americans had cracked their newest ciphers. Others blamed a rogue transmitter. One theorized a mole inside their Warsaw Pact partners' militaries. But all were wrong. The Americans had done none of those things. They'd simply listened better, faster, longer, and then acted accordingly. The most painful truth? The Soviets had fired no shots. They had suffered no losses. But their entire system had been exposed not by spies or satellites, but by their own routine signals, caught and processed by an enemy that turned information into domination. It was a defeat no one saw. No cities bombed, no tanks destroyed, just a silence that grew louder and unmistakably American. By 1980, the Soviet Union's signal security doctrine was no longer simply compromised. It was bankrupt. What had begun as a quiet American advantage had metastasized into a structural cancer inside the Red War machine. The ideological core of Soviet strategy, mass mobilization, centralized command, and control by radio was suddenly its greatest liability. Military leaders couldn't issue orders without triggering a listening alert in West Germany. They couldn't rehearse exercises without being shadowed by NATO counter-drills. They couldn't redeploy armored columns without detection from invisible ears buried along signal paths they didn't even know existed. Worse still, the doctrine of deception, long a pillar of Soviet military art, was shattered. Maskirovka, Soviet strategic camouflage, relied on manipulating enemy assumptions, but when the enemy wasn't guessing, when they already knew, there was no misdirection left. The psychological toll was severe. Commanders began to delay radio orders, paralyzed by the fear of instant detection. Some units reverted to handwritten courier messages. Others tried to re-engineer entire signal trees mid-exercise. Nothing worked. Every layer of the Soviet command structure designed for vertical speed and political control was being outrun by an American system that needed no orders, only patterns. In closed-door sessions, even the Politburo expressed concern, not over lost ground, but over lost invisibility. The revelation that American SIGINT could shadow movements, expose deployments, and preempt action without ever engaging physically without even violating borders had broken the myth of Soviet control. What remained was paralysis masquerading as doctrine. Ideologically, it was a death blow. The Soviet Union had always sold itself as the master of strategy, the inheritor of deep operations theory, the machine of mechanized perfection. But now it was clear. A handful of silent receivers and a few lines of code had exposed every gear in that machine. The Americans didn't need bigger weapons. They didn't need better tanks. They just needed to hear. And the Soviet system built on noise had given them everything. The Cold War ended not with a bang, but with silence. In the years following the Soviet collapse, former officers and engineers slowly pieced together the scale of the American listening campaign. Some spoke anonymously. Others published memoirs, sanitized for safety. All carried the same undertone: disbelief, not just at being outmaneuvered, but at never even knowing they were in a battle. The ghost that haunted them wasn't stealth bombers or cruise missiles. It was the realization that the enemy had been listening the entire time. Long after the Berlin Wall fell, remnants of the NSA's silent war were uncovered in places no one expected: beneath embassy floors, inside utility panels, hidden in decommissioned radio towers. Tiny black boxes that never spoke, never blinked, never moved. But for decades, they had shifted the balance of power. Today, as cyber warfare replaces shortwave signals and data packets eclipse radio waves, the lessons remain. Victory often belongs not to the loudest force, but to the quietest one that understands the map of noise. Modern analysts study these operations not for nostalgia, but for architecture, because the structure of silence, the layering, the triangulation, the predictive modeling remains the foundation of every digital battlefield to come. For the Soviet Union, the collapse wasn't just political or economic, it was epistemic. They thought they knew the shape of war, but the Americans had redrawn it, using only information and silence. And in the end, the most devastating weapon of all was the one they never heard.